important context to this is that's unfortunately a result of all the sort of systematic destruction of that cultural knowledge, right? So it doesn't have to be this way, right? There's other ways. If we have a community where breastfeeding is supported and people are knowledgeable about breastfeeding, then we don't have to do this kind of heroic approach. There's always going to be cases where we're going to need more assistance, but those issues can be addressed a lot of times with the knowledge around you. A community that's breastfeeding supportive would have some of those resources available. These kinds of undermining of local knowledge play a huge role in how much you need to be able to overcome the barriers, the structural barriers, and then of course the cultural barriers. Breastfeeding is often stigmatized and hidden, whereas, in a setting where it's supported and it's like a no big deal, non-event, they're just doing it. And it doesn't mean that they may not face challenges, but the way that they overcome those challenges is very different.
It is funny for me to think about the fact that my daughter was born in 2005, and this is before Facebook or even smartphones, any of the social media that we have today. So for me, what this meant is that back in 2004, when I was pregnant, there wasn't a lot of information readily available on pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding. And, even though I had my mom and my grandmother around, they just weren't particularly knowledgeable on these subjects. Even though my grandmother had 5 children, she was a product of that systematic breakdown of information that happened when we started to see births being moved from the home to the hospital setting. And this is something that we saw in the 19th century, early 20th century. And so by the time my grandmother had her 5 children in the 40s and 50s, this was something that had been in place for decades. With these hospital births, women were often giving birth under some form of anesthesia, and after the baby was born, they were separating the baby from the mother. They were discouraging breastfeeding, and this is because at this time, the medical community felt that infant formula was far superior to breast milk. And so the consequence of these systems that were in place is that there was a major loss of knowledge. And we might think that childbirth and breastfeeding are completely instinctive, but they're not. And we often face a lot of challenges that are not talked about with childbirth and breastfeeding. So in the 1960s, you start to see a shift in this kind of need and desire for women to be more knowledgeable in childbirth.
Almost every woman can be taught to give birth successfully, and since the first birth is usually the hardest, all the births you will see are first babies. None of these mothers had or wanted any medication, not even aspirin. The art of giving birth has gradually declined to where very few people, even doctors, have ever seen a normal woman give birth to a baby naturally.
The problem was that it was kind of like this localized knowledge set, if you will. These courses were typically taking place in the hospital, usually the hospital where you were going to give birth. So the knowledge wasn't really being passed down. It was mostly for the couples that were attending the classes. So it was kind of being managed by the medical community. Interestingly enough, at this same time period, we start to see what is called active management of labor. And this is where hospitals have protocols in place to intervene if they feel like a labor is progressing too slowly. And some of these interventions include breaking the woman's waters or administering Pitocin, and all of this helps to speed up the labor. And so what this all ultimately leads to is, you can have all the knowledge, you can have all the information about childbirth, but if you're in a hospital setting and the medical team is looking at you and telling you that they need to intervene, you're going to go with what they tell you.
When do you get to see a fully natural birth? Rarely. Almost never.
The result is a real loss of agency. And so while this active management of labor becomes this standard practice of care in the hospital setting, on the other side, you start to have this counterculture, this natural birth movement. And in 1959, you have Stan Brakhage, who comes out with his film, Window, Water, Baby Moving. In France, you have Michel Audin, who's a gynecologist. He becomes a real advocate of this non-violent birth, and he's the first one to really promote using birthing pools during labor. But the most prominent advocates of this movement are Ina May Gaskin and her husband Stephen, and they literally start a community around this concept of having a natural birth. And so what you start to see through this community that they've started, it's out on a farm in rural Tennessee. You start to see this kind of dismantling of these cultural and structural barriers that we usually see around childbirth and breastfeeding. And so because it's in this kind of commune type of setting, the women have a lot of built-in support around them. They're not worried about maternity leave or childcare. There's a sharing of the responsibilities and the chores that have to be done. And in this community, there isn't a stigma around co-sleeping. And all of these things help to facilitate long-term successful breastfeeding. And I think the takeaway is that these communities are instrumental in passing on knowledge and information. But it also shows how incredibly important it is to have a sense of support. And I think that this is something that social media can provide.
I don't know everything, but there is just so much I feel like nobody talks about before the baby's here. They can talk about, you can read and learn about how pregnancy is going to go. You can read and learn about how, you can hope for vaginal, how vaginal will be, or whatever, medicated or unmedicated. And you can hope that your baby's going to be sleep trained at 3 months. Again, there's research out there that that's not possible. Just so you know, when I killed myself over that. The Badass Breastfeeding Podcast. I wouldn't say I'm religious about it, but I definitely listened to a few of them. I've listened to a couple of them that helped me feel sane about him not sleeping. That was one of them that really, that's when I found them, and that one helped me a lot.
I'm listening to this one called Birthful. I like it because they're short, so I listen to it like on my way to work. My commute to work is only 10 minutes, so I listen to one on the way and then one on the way home. And it's just a lot of the stuff seems to line up with the whole doula perspective and all of that natural mindedness, and but more fact-based, based on your hormones and what's happening and all those things. So I'm trying to, right now, all I'm pretty much worried about is like exiting this thing.
So when I joined the forum, there was like, everyone had a profile name. So you started to get to know people by their profile name. When you're all going through the same thing together, you kind of explore it together. Like, you all sort of go through the same thing. So, the morning sickness, most of us were going through the same thing, the morning sickness. It was sort of like, you didn't feel so, it was like this team, like we were all going through the changes of our body together. Most of us was new mums, so we were exploring this for the very first time. There might be people in the group that have already had children who were great with their, experiences and their advice from their first child. I don't know. I don't think anyone really understands what it's like to live in another country, but a country so far away from your country and in another language with absolutely no family support. I don't think my friends nor my family back home get the struggles that I have gone through and what I still sometimes go through.